Welcome to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast. Hi, I'm David Manti, and welcome to a new episode of the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast. With me today is Kyle Neathery, CEO of Samson Extracts. Thank you very much for joining me today, Kyle.
Hey, happy to be here, David. Thanks for having me on, and always looking forward to talking about cannabis and the equipment that goes for cannabis. So happy to be here.
Well, before we get started, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You could also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. If you want to email the podcast, you can reach me at david@cannabisequipmentnews.com with email the podcast in the subject line. You can also subscribe to our daily newsletter. Make sure you get it delivered to your inbox first. Kyle, I always like to start with a little bit of background. How was it that you found yourself working in cannabis?
Yeah, so I started in cannabis in late 2019. I operated before Samson Extracts. I started my experience off in Michigan, in the mature medical market, recently new adult use market at that time. And really, my story is I was working at Southwest Airlines. It's kind of a chief of staff for a big department there, and my best friend at Southwest. Her dad was working in cannabis, and we were talking about doing some side consulting and things like that. And I've wrapped up a couple of big projects at Southwest and told him I'd actually be interested in taking the jump, which, I was hesitant at that time. Yeah, I had a good resume and with some large companies, but I did. And that's kind of how it happened. Ended up in Michigan after living in Dallas. So that's a little bit of the story there.
What was it like moving from the aviation sector into, I guess, sort of big cannabis in Michigan?
Yeah, it was it was a bit of a learning curve. I've always, in my mind, I think a lot of times people, see cannabis as a super weird industry, but it has many similarities that you see in other industries in terms of having inputs and outputs. But the biggest, one of the things with aviation, heavily regulated, just like regulated cannabis is. So very familiar with regulator intervention and some of those things that can occur from the processing side. But a lot of it was the biggest part that was different for me was going from aviation to then cultivating. A lot goes into cultivation that I don't think people understand, really at a detailed level, and understanding how minor events can impact cultivation in so many ways. Learning how plants grow indoors, there's a whole science to that I think people just think you just put something in soil or media or something like that and then it starts blooming, but there's so much that goes into it. So the cultivation was probably the biggest learning curve from my side. But production and manufacturing, that's kind of my bread and butter from my background at and the business management side. So that was much more easy for me to focus on there up front. Did you have any regulator intervention in Michigan? We actually had a really good relationship with our regulators there. I was working at High Life Farms. That was the company in Michigan I worked for, and we were the first licensee there in the state of Michigan, in the town of Chesaning, Michigan. And when it was starting early, I think we did a really good job. Hand holding's probably pejorative, but we worked together with the regulators to kind of help them figure things out, because we knew about cannabis and they knew the regulations they wanted to put through. But as you see a lot of times in these states don't hire cannabis experienced regulators. Oftentimes it might be state troopers, or if that state has casinos, gaming officials, former law enforcement, and they know cannabis from the enforcement perspective and some of those principles. But we worked together kind of hand in hand to kind of learn together and walk together. So we always had a good relationship, and we were proactive. If we did have issues because these things happen. It's a new industry, you have issues that come up, of course, but we always tried to have more of a proactive relationship with regulators than the reactive. I think if you sit back and wait for them to do things, or, whatever type of administrative processes that happen, then you're setting yourself up for failure, because you're having to answer a lot of questions rather than just being transparent and forthright at the beginning.
What are some of those things that go into cultivation that you think maybe some people don't see from the outside looking in?
Well, really, it's I'd say where the ones that was so crazy for me is just the lighting schedules alone. And there's things when you go from growing outdoors to growing indoors, and especially in regulated cannabis that you have to do. And I can think of one example just for that we had where regulated cannabis, you have cameras everywhere. It's all in the facilities and those things. Well, we had one camera go out in one of our indoor rooms, and so that camera got replaced. Well, next thing you know, after a few days, we had a full room have a hermaphroditic transformation in that room because that camera had an invisible infrared light to the human eye, but the plants could detect that. So just those things like that, it's these minor things that don't really come into play, but you have to be cognizant of every piece of that environment. And especially even when it comes to the set pointing of temperatures. If you don't have systems that are you have backups for those systems, resiliency for those systems, and you're running lights in those rooms, and then all of a sudden your ACs go down, you're set up for a disaster. So it's not just as easy as growing. Your infrastructure and backup of infrastructure is things that have to be taken into consideration. But it's really a number of things. For me, it was like when I got into cannabis, I didn't know that you do a certain amount of lighting for vegetative rooms, you do a certain amount of light for flowering rooms, and all of those. So it's really me who had never really grown anything or had a green thumb from any perspective. It was really having to learn kind of there at the basics.
What was it like? Was it fairly easy to trace the issue back to that new camera just because it was what was new in the room, or was it a little difficult to figure it out?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I'm big on, especially when you're doing changes or you're doing projects, is making micro movements with those changes and projects, and that's something I'm a huge believer in. And you're exactly right. Everything was the same, everything was normal, but we could identify it to that one camera. And whenever you have plants that become hermaphroditic, that usually has a lot to do with, more times than not, on the lighting side. Like there may be other forms of stresses or pollen that may introduce, but for indoor, lighting is always a big one, and that could be lighting from the hallway if you have a window on the door and those types of things. But that's just a big principle of mine. I think is changing small things when you do those things, because to your point, if people are taking on massive projects and changing multiple factors, whether you have success or whether you have failure, you can't exactly tell what moved the needle either direction.
When did you come up with the concept or sort of the philosophy behind micro movements? Did something happen at a previous job, or is it just been a best practices thing for you?
Well, a little bit. So I'm certified in Lean Six Sigma, and that's a big one, at least for my principles, is that you study your movements more than just say you're going to do things. So you try to have an approach, you try to have a practicality to when you do things, and you want to study what those effects are after. But a lot of that is you have to know what you're doing before. And so I gravitate more towards the data side, more towards the numbers side. And a big thing that you see with Lean Six Sigma is when you're having defects or issues within a process, you need to be able to finally understand those things. And so a lot of it's just my principles that I've learned by going through those certifications, but that goes everywhere from things I've done at Southwest, implementing reservation systems, doing organizational changes. It's better to kind of do the death by 1,000 cuts when you're making massive changes than trying to eat something in just one complete bite.
Was High Life Farms already into sort of the lean thinking, or was that something that you brought to the company?
It was something that we kind of got into as I got there, and it was not necessarily. Some of that was because when I had gotten to High Life, what I kind of think about, cannabis companies in phases, and they were kind of in that figure it out, let's just get it going phase. It's you build something and then you just want to try to get to X. You're not thinking about how can you do it most effectively, how can you do it most cost efficiently. You're not necessarily thinking. You're just saying, can we do it? And I think we really picked, when I got there, we're just past the can we do it phase. And it was good timing because it was right when we saw the transition. I got there in December of 19, and rec adult use just started picking up there in January. So then, as you know, what happens when you have market transformation in that form or fashion, you've massive demand spikes. So we almost had to, out of necessity. And so one of our biggest things we tackled there was, of course, gummy production. As we were the licensed manufacturer in Michigan for Wana gummies, and they were seeing explosive demand. And so that was really the first place, I would say, in that facility that we tackled from a lean manufacturing perspective, because our goal was to get exponential volume increases without much introduction of additional equipment.
So without bringing in additional equipment, when you have that kind of explosion in demand on your end, how do you sort of manage expectations without kind of getting ahead of your skis?
Well, a lot of it is you do have, well, the big one is you have to, the people that are involved, the people that are doing the job, is you have to have a pretty good why, and they also have to be bought in on that why. I think a lot of times when you're having process changes, organizational changes, a lot of time that gets preached as the what, and I don't think there's enough time spent on the why. So bringing a lot of people on those journeys and letting them know exactly what we're thinking, what we're trying to do. But even before that, when you're even talking about changes, you have to get them involved on the data gathering process too. I think if you have leadership that leads from the ivory tower and those types of things, you're going to be making changes that don't actually make impacts. Your thoughts or your opinions, you get weighed into it too much. So you have to actually, as a leader, in my opinion, is spending time in those stations, in the floor, and doing those jobs, because you will not have an accurate opinion on what the actual challenge is. What are the challenges? Is the equipment spread out too far? Are people having to work multiple stations rather than focusing on critical stations? Is waiting? So are people not getting ingredients into the system quick enough? And so I think you have to bring the people that are actually doing the job into that journey.
So when and why the jump to Samson extracts?
Well, so a little bit. I am originally from Louisiana. And Michigan was, didn't know, I obviously had great friends at High Life Farms and things like that, but me and my wife were recently married. And part of it, I wanted to get back down south. I'd kind of gotten into that mindset. Not that I'm a huge Southern lover or anything like that, but I do like the South, and it's just dang cold. I mean, that was a lot of it. It was people don't realize it's not just cold. It could be 6 to 7 months of depressing darkness and cold that comes as a part of it. And I wanted to get closer to my parents. And once again, I love my team at High Life. We ran an incredibly successful operation over 2 years while I was there. But there was an opportunity in Alabama that it came across me, and it was to be a CEO of not only the hemp company, but also on the medical cannabis venture that was starting in Alabama. And so that medical cannabis part to me was, that was kind of an interesting value proposition, because me being from the South, we all understand the conservative roots that occur in the South. And I kind of saw that as I went off to a regulated state, learned my skills, got my experience, understand how to run those operations, and then being able to bring that into a Southern state where it was taboo for so long. And there's just not a lot of talent down here. So for me, it was like being able to almost take everything I've learned and being able to bring it into a state where they didn't have that experience level.
So you're working both on the CBD side and on the medical side?
I am, yeah. So a bit of the hip part, of course, from the operational perspective has been my main focus. But not sure if you're in tune with the Alabama medical cannabis situation, but we submitted our applications into for medical cannabis in December of 22. And it's kind of the same thing that you see a lot of states, inundated by lawsuits, questions about the process of selecting, and I mean, and that's fine. Our umbrella of companies, we are a diversified enterprise amongst our companies. So it's like, hey, hemp's doing really well, so we just focus on hemp. We're not hemming and hawing. We're not spending a lot of time and money on lawyers. We'll just kind of let it do its thing. If it works out, that's amazing. And if it doesn't, we all know that hemp is still a great industry as well.
Yeah, because so as far as I know, in Alabama, it's like medically legal, but you can't get it anywhere yet, right?
It is, yeah. It's been in legislation in terms of approval for a while.
Mm-hmm.
It took a couple of years, even after the legislation was passed, to get the application process in. So, and it is a restrictive product base too. It's no smokable flower. No flavored edibles. There could be almost like a peach gummy product. It's very restrictive medical. And so I think there will be challenges from my perspective. You have Mississippi that's led a very aggressive medical market pursuit. You have Louisiana that is a very mature medical market pursuit. And then of course to the southern border is Florida, who we all know is a large industry already. with talks of going recreational potentially here in this election season. So I think it will be challenging. I think it'll be interesting to see how Alabama feels that way, because most states, to improve patient engagement, they'll increase product scope, increase cost scope and those things. But there will be a lot of pressure from border states, because there's one thing I know from Michigan, and I think everyone knows, is that people will drive for this product, and these regulated markets have to be cognizant of how to keep their customer base in state.
No, I mean, I'm based in Madison, Wisconsin. We certainly know that. Like, it doesn't matter where you live in Wisconsin, people will drive, and they can pretty much drive in every direction now and find it somewhere else.
Yeah, for sure. And we saw that in Michigan, specifically with Wisconsin. The Upper Peninsula of Michigan, not heavily populated, not a lot of year-round citizens there that live in that area, but there's a lot of dang dispensaries up there, especially when you looked at those connection points to Wisconsin. Cartridge sales, for instance, were explosive in the Upper Peninsula. And then we saw the same thing when in southern Michigan, before Illinois got more aggressive, Ohio was high taxing, and you have Indiana. I mean, the southern and northern borders of Michigan really did that. They were some of the best stores for that reason. Of course, things have matured since then, but the people will drive. I mean, there's people driving from Kentucky, Tennessee to Michigan. I mean, people will drive for it, and the limits that the states put on are pretty friendly for a quick trip.
What kind of scale are you working on now from a hemp and CBD side compared to the size of the operation at High Life?
No comparison whatsoever. No comparison whatsoever. And man, that has been a challenge. When you look at marijuana or cannabis, medical cannabis, adult use cannabis extraction, those labs, 1,500 square feet. If you're really big, you might be looking at 2,500 square feet. You have equipment that you potentially bought off the shelf, or it was manufactured, and it's plug and play. There's a user guide that comes with it. And we did all that. And we ran a great extraction operation, but we were pumped. If we extracted north of 1,000 pounds a month, because you didn't really need to do more, because if you have an 80% distillate, you can get 8,000 units of 100 milligram gummies off of that. That's a substantial amount that comes off a kilo distillate, but it's nowhere near comparison here, and that's been our biggest learning curve. Connor Schilling, who led my extraction at High Life, he's here too. Great extraction operator, knows a lot about the chemistry, but when you go from dealing with over 1,000 pounds a month to close to 200,000 pounds, north of 200,000 pounds a month, you're using way different equipment. You have way different issues. You're buying equipment that wasn't made. Its initial design and function had nothing to do with cannabis. Cannabis probably wasn't even a thought when it was created, and so we're using massive equipment here. Just for example, as in medical cannabis, adult use cannabis, we were using small cryo ethanol, basket centrifuges that spun everything out. Well, here we're using, for our extractions, we're using large centrifuges, dewatering centrifuges that you would see be used in upstream oil and gas. So you're talking about massive amounts of volume, and it shows up in different ways too, because your bottleneck creation comes so much more quickly. You have an increase on biomass extraction, then you're having to say how our winterization can't handle this. So then you're upsizing pipes on winterization, you're upsizing pumps. Then can you recover quickly enough? And it's this constant bottleneck chase with exponential increase in volume that I tell you, it feels like interstate construction. It really does. Feels like they start at one side of the interstate, they redo the whole thing. By the time they're done with it, they're back doing the first part. I mean, it really is like that. There's some fun and challenges to it, but man, we've had some failure. And you really have to, you really begin to have a love for engineers, because this thing does take calculations of material movement, the chemistries you don't understand, what pipe sizing does to vacuum. And all we're redoing our distillation tower right now because we bought a big vacuum pump, massive vacuum pump, probably the biggest one we could get, but our pipes were too small. So we were creating supersonic speeds inside of our vacuum. So just things like that. It's just a completely different scale.
What were some of those failures that you've had? I mean, like you just mentioned, but also have you had some successes?
Oh, we've had a tremendous amount of successes. I mean, when we started here, they were probably doing 20,000 pounds a month, and now we've got capabilities to do well over 200,000. And we implemented winterization here. They didn't have a winterization capability, so we implemented winterization. They didn't have the capability to make distillate at that time, so we had to re-engineer the complete distillation tower. And this isn't like a white film distillation piece you would see that's the size of a door. Ours is 4 stories tall. And so you want to talk about some problem identification, crawling around a bunch of pipes and motors and electrical, that's on a 4 story tower and stuff like that. So we re-engineered that. We've increased pipe sizing. That was too small. So there was a tremendous amount of successes, but there were failures, kind of like we said earlier. I mean, some of them and some of it goes to, because of the scale, it can be tricky for operators as well. We've had to change things very rapidly and very quickly. And we probably haven't done the best job of giving the operators, the week-long trainings of how to operate that equipment, but we just couldn't out of necessity. So, we've had issues where we weren't winterizing long enough. The temperature gauge for winterization wasn't in the right place, so we were getting false senses of security of how cold we were winterizing at. Augers for material movement. We drop our biomass into big hoppers. We had an auger we were going to implement. Well, it was too steep, so the biomass actually couldn't travel up to do what it was supposed to do. So it's those types of things that we are scrappy. We don't mind buying used equipment. We have a mechanical team that can work on our stuff, but what's good is we stay on our feet. So we'll hit that failure and we're like, all right, now we know how to do it, so we don't have to make that mistake again.
No, it sounds like it's very trying, but it also sounds like it's kind of like an engineer's dream scenario.
It is. I would say so. And boy, there was a lot of engineering that could have happened there, during that time. And we really just started using engineers from a serious perspective. We just engaged with a chemical engineer, and that's how we figured out some of the issues in our distillation, is that our vacuum was pulling supersonic speeds. So we were creating so much pressure inside of our pot still that our vacuum wasn't able to actually be as high in the pot as it was the pump. And so we actually have, that's why we're glad we have this engineer, because there are all these little projects, especially quick win stuff. We're not experts at that, but if someone can kind of be partnered with us to do the math, I mean, they could really have worked for a long time. But we brought on, and before August of last year, we didn't have our own in-house mechanical capability for welding, and motor rebuilding, those types of things. We were outsourcing a lot of that work. We actually took one of the supervisors from that company we're outsourcing, brought him in-house, and he absolutely loves it, just like you're saying, because it's not a lot of crazy stuff. You just need someone with the capability to do it and put it in. And he likes to see, because I think what else is good about bringing those people in-house is they not only get to fix the issue, but they actually get to see the results, learn from it, and then they just kind of move on to the next thing.
So when you moved to Samson, did you kind of have to shelve the micro movements idea just because the scale was so much larger, or do you maintain the same philosophy just on a much larger scale?
We had to be it was pretty transformational change on the pieces of equipment. And a lot of it, when I think about kind of the phases, I think that's a good topic to cover on, is I've seen I'm almost here for 2 years here in March, and we've kind of been in 3 phases throughout that time. And I would say really that first phase of time was make the whole system work. So you can put something in at the beginning and you can get something out. That's that kind of just see if you can do it phase. We then spent phase 2, which was, now that we know we can do it, we can understand the process. Now let's actually increase that scale tremendously. So it became a hardcore bottleneck focus. Where were we queuing up material at? Where was my cellar sitting at so it couldn't go to the next step? As a part of that process, we shifted to 24/7 operations. So then we had every hour we were producing as a scale increase. And now we've entered into the phase of quality improvement. So now that we know we can do it, we now know we can do it at scale. Now let's go back and start spending more time on quality, and those, now we're in that micro movement phase. I'd say we're at where if we're like for instance, we just implemented some new carbon filtration, but our team also wanted to do like 3 or 4 things at that same time. But it's like, let's just do the carbon filtration, see where we're at, and then make those steps. So now that we're in the quality phase, it really is. It's like focus on one piece, do it, let's see the output. One piece, do it, let's see the output. And then we're kind of making changes here as we move throughout.
Is the CBD hemp side of the business more like traditional manufacturing? Or would you say, is it more like or is it more, nascent and immature?
The way we extract, the way we're operating doesn't feel like cannabis to me. It is a lot of scale. There's not a lot of people doing the type of volume we're doing. It feels much more like, but I did oil and gas consulting prior to Southwest. It feels much more like an oil and gas operation to me than it does a cannabis operation, or just other type of, whether it's seed oil manufacturing or those types of other extraction operations. It sometimes it doesn't feel like a cannabis company because of just the scale and what I'm used to in regulated cannabis.
So, who are you supplying?
So we strictly focus on CBD here from the manufacturing perspective. We only do CBD. We're not dealing in the minors or doing a lot of those things. So right now we're making a ton of CBD distillate every month. And right now we just see ourselves as an ingredient provider. There's a lot of folks. Isolate we know has massive staying power in the industry. There are some companies that do want our products to potentially convert and do some things like that. But I'd say the large portion of our companies have a focus towards isolate, which that's the capability. If things keep going our way, that we will actually have that capability to make our own isolate in the house by this summer.
Okay. I've talked to a couple of people in the industry, and they've kind of, with the legalization of recreational and more legalization with medical, they've said that, sort of the CBD side of the business has almost become an afterthought in some things. And as a result, there's been sort of a decrease in products and availability. Have you experienced that as well?
I think so. When you're strictly talking about CBD, we've had a lot of the retail conversations, should we do CBD gummies? Should we do all this? It's super, when you're thinking about strictly from the psychoactive perspective, that is an incredibly hard market to compete with. Incredibly hard. But we do have some retail focuses of going more into leading more into the topical side, applications in that world, because then you're not dealing so much you're not competing with other psychoactive providers on that side. But I and that sentiment, listen, I had that sentiment years ago in the cannabis side, like who would want CBD? And I tell you, the hemp-derived cannabinoid stuff has really, really been quite the eye-opener, and how that market has been growing. I know everyone's on pins and needles to see what the Farm Bill will show up as or what type of regulation will be included, but man, it kind of feels like it's hard to put that genie back into the bottle with some of the operational maturity you're seeing people jump in. I mean, I think the one that really caught me off guard here recently was Total Wine and Spirits. It's a massive liquor mart chain. And I was reading an article last week that they have Delta 9 drinks in 228 stores in 26 states. Man, that's crazy. I would have never thought that to be. I remember we were laughing in 2021. Men's Health, I think it was, had the Trojan Horse hemp-derived Delta 9 gummies. I remember there was a full page spread in there. We're like, oh, this will never. What's this? This will never happen. And man, we were wrong. So I don't mean to go on a tangent there, but just to kind of dial it back. I mean, it seems that way, but now it seems like the regulated marijuana companies are trying to go the hemp route. You saw Kiva Brands. They were frustrated with a lot of the hemp products, I think, and now they're making their own hemp products. So I wish I could guess what's going to happen, but it seems like for the hemp-derived cannabinoids, that space is growing faster than most people can keep up with.
Well, tangents always welcome, but we had a similar experience with someone locally who was making hemp-derived beverages, and same thing. We're just like, well, where's the demand for that? And just every time I talk to him now, he's in so many different locations. And I'm just like, and and after trying the product, I'm like, oh, I get it.
Yeah. The adoption is at an incredible rate. I think that, and and I understand the argument. I understand the arguments from regulated cannabis, and that it's like, man, we pay these taxes, we have all these hurdles we jump through, and the hemp products are able to kind of move around with a little more agility and freedom to do that stuff. So I understand the frustrations that if I was still in regulated cannabis, I would be pissed. I would be mad. But but you're right. It's creating adoption. It's creating people to understand the product. And I know it's an absolute war right now between marijuana and hemp from the operator's perspective, but I think at the end of the day, is everyone has to understand. I know money creates challenges, but we all got to remember why we're doing this and why we're fans of it, and that's that everyone wants deregulation and everyone wants access. All these things, and it's creating a very interesting conversation for access to people that would not have that, and so. I know everyone's crying foul, but is the goal at the end of the day to make money, or is the goal at the end of the day to have this product that everyone thinks should be legal and to be out there in the marketplace? I think it's created some very interesting conversations, especially with the Schedule 3 stuff, where there's a lot of operators in marijuana saying, "Whoa, we don't know if we want to deschedule now because then big pharma can come in." And it's like probably the same people 10 years ago were like, "Deregulate." It's very interesting.
No, it's definitely a pick your poison type of industry, and kind of make sure you can figure it out on your feet.
Yeah, no, and man, it is not for the industry is not for the person that wants to go in at 9 and leave at 5 at the same time every day. I mean, it's incredibly fluid. It changes constantly. If you don't have your thumb on the market and understand what's going on, it will run past you. And it does not take long, especially when you're talking about commoditized pricing with oils and things like that.
So it sounds like you have a really cool extraction system in place at Samson, and I understand that it's proprietary. Is there anything else you can tell me about how it works?
Yeah, and that's what the real thing is. That there isn't. I know that the proprietary word is used a lot, but really it's. A lot of it is, and I can kind of even walk through it, is, we take biomass super sacks. Those usually come in 500 pounds, for rough numbers. Because biomass across the country comes in a variety of different shapes and sizes. What I mean by that is there isn't a really good standard for how biomass should look. So we drop our biomass into a large agri chopper like you would see on a farm where they like bust hay and a bale buster, so to speak. We get it to a uniform size in that process so that we can work with stems or different bud biomass sizes that come through, which then loads into a big hopper. And then we hit our big centrifuges. I mean, these centrifuges are massive. They're probably 10 by 6 in terms of just the centrifuge, spinning 3,500 RPMs on 35 horsepower motors, 235 horsepower motors. That biomass comes in and then it enters into a mass separation. Biomass gets separated, then we collect our oil, and we just kind of recirculate that whole process. That same ethanol oil mix will then keep extracting through, and we'll just keep extracting until we hit a certain pound level that meets our concentration. And then it gets pretty similar. That's a very different step than what you would see in normal cannabis extraction. But then we get to a pretty similar step where we enter into winterization. Of course, hit our temperatures. We use a massive 30-foot long filter press, and that filter press is probably 4 feet by 4 feet on plate size. Massive filter press that gets filtered. We have another 4-story falling film recovery unit where we take a lot of our recovery from. We then, of course, decarb in a massive unit, and then we distill. And our distillation is a massive short path. We've looked at the white film. We get concerned with sugar content and stuff like that in the products with white film from jamming. But if you think about like the laptop short path that you would have used in chemistry class, ours is a massive one made out of stainless steel. So we load 400 kilograms of crude in, and we just raise the heat like a moonshine still, raise it. We do all of our terpene cuts, heads cuts, all the non-desirables. and then we have a switch off, and then we start loading into our distillation tank. So it's really pretty standard. It's just massive equipment that has to support that process.
What kind of footprint is it sitting in?
If you did a collective kind of the total footprint of the equipment, equipment's probably taking up 25 to 30,000 square feet of equipment, and it's all outside. That's the other weird part we haven't talked about yet, is our equipment is outside. So we have to then think about different variables to that point. Is, when you're doing normal extraction, you're indoors and it's climate controlled and it feels great. Well, we're in Alabama. We could be 105 degrees with 95% humidity, or we can be 20 degrees with dryness. And it's just not, when I say that, it's not that I'm concerned about the operator's well-being when they're operating. It's that directly impacts our capability to extract from the equipment. And that also creates weird problems. And one thing we had to do with our solids extraction is we had to build a huge awning to cover the whole thing, because this year, when we got into our hot summers, it was superheating our ethanol and then pulling more non-desirables into our micella from the oil mixture. So we covered it, and now we're good. And so there's all, and then, well, to go back, distillation. We were having some trouble collecting distillate, our distillation tower, in this winter time, and it's because one spot on the column wasn't insulated, so it was staying super cold. So the vapor would go up, hit it, fall, hit it, fall, hit it, fall, and it didn't have time to travel. So we had all those ambient temperature, ambient humidity issues. It has an impact on our equipment, which also creates other fun challenges.
Why is it outside?
Well, it's a good. I wasn't here in the decision-making process, but some of it is probably the pure size of the equipment. The buildings that we purchased and bought, we have three massive buildings, kind of in a tenth of a mile corridor of each other. They were all for cotton production. So cotton gins, cotton storage, and those types of things. So we already had infrastructure here, and some of that equipment just frankly would not fit. But I also think there's probably some consideration to infrastructure that's needed for extraction when you're indoors versus outdoors. If you're operating whether C1D1, C1D2, you have to do a lot of things indoors. But those issues free up as you get outside, because you have air movement. So you still have to support the equipment from the C1D1, C1D2 matter. But there's a lot of things you don't necessarily have to do that you would have to do indoors. And, that class one infrastructure cost can really get substantial, especially with the equipment of this size.
Okay, so is the plan for the foreseeable future to keep it outside?
It is. We have no change from that. I think if anything, we will cover the equipment with metal fabricated, awnings and things like that. And that's so we can control ambient factors. And also to increase the quality of life for some of our operators, because a lot of times they're operating equipment in direct sunlight in the middle of Alabama summer. We're 5 minutes from Florida, so it can be pretty intense. But I don't see much changing there. Our isolation system that we're implementing is indoors, so there really is no plan to ever move from the outdoor strategy. And I think it would be incredibly tough if we did.
Was the facility GMP certified before you got there, or was that something you implemented?
It was. They did have a GMP certification there at that time, and then we still carried that forward. I will say what we did have to do is we had to marry, as I got here, we had to marry GMP with cost effectiveness more. I would say that's more of my implementations there, is that you can overdo GMP. And we do support GMP. We love GMP, but we do have to make money. You got to remember what comes first, the certification or the business. So we did make some modifications that are still GMP, still square and for GMP certification, but we did have to make some alterations to make sure that we weren't overspending for the sake of a certification and still able to target profitability.
How much biomass, and if you already mentioned it, I apologize for missing it, but how much biomass are you processing an hour?
So the hour, we're typically, depending on biomass type, because that can cause challenges. I would say on the low end, we're probably $250 an hour. And then On the high end side, we can climb up. If it's really smooth biomass, we can get up to the 600, 625s an hour. So if we've got older biomass, it's got a lot of stems, we're going to hang out more at that lower end. But if we've got some well manicured, well treated stuff, I mean, it can really cruise through the system almost too fast. Sometimes we have to slow the system down so we don't creep into an overproduction state.
How do you find and vet your suppliers, your farming partners?
If anyone has a perfect plan to that, please reach out to me on LinkedIn, because man, that outside of the challenges we've had in production, that by far is my biggest frustration in the industry as a whole. My experience, regulated cannabis, we had metric that you knew where it was coming from, you knew who had it. The test results were in there from the third party labs. So you had a lot of buyer confidence when you were making deals with biomass and hard resources in that fashion. But man, the hemp part, we've had some deals go great. We've had a lot of deals not go great. Some of that I think is largely due to the oversupply that happened from 19 to early 21. Because there's a lot of biomass when I got here that had been on the market for a number of years, and there's a lot of farmers that were challenged and had a lot of things not go their way. Tales all this time in the hemp industry. And so, a lot of challenges because, this biomass is grown everywhere, and you still have to be effective with your travel. So our process typically would be that you request a sample. If you're at terms, you test our sample in-house. We get into the same ballpark on pricing, and then we like to send someone out there to make sure it exists. Believe it or not, that is a problem where you're being sold biomass that potentially doesn't exist. Make sure it exists. Take our own sample there, send it to testing. If you feel comfortable that you got the same results as you did on the initial sample, then you move to a contracting state. And I cannot tell you, a third of the deals we've done, the biomass percent after that phase is not what we tested and what we did. I dealt with one last summer where we tested 8%, and when all the trucks got here is at 3%. And so it's frustrating because even though hemp's trading, 8% material can trade at, call it 220, 230 a pound. That doesn't seem like a lot, but when you're doing a 700,000 pound contract on it, that adds up. And then you get to part two. In normal business, if you bought something, it wasn't what you bought, you can say, hey, this isn't what I got. Give me my money back. I'll return the product to you. That doesn't really happen on the hemp side. And because a lot of times it's farmers or brokers. Brokers have really heavily got into the system, but it's like, hey, that farmer lost all their money in 19 when they grew it, so they don't even have money to give you the payback. The money you paid them is going towards bills, it's going towards these things, so there's no money to return. And so then, as you're looking at make right solutions or settlement solutions and things like that, it's this creative dealing you're having to do. So, because they may not be farming anymore, or maybe they're expecting to farm, and then you're saying, all right, to pay us back, you got to give us a 10 cents discount per pound, and hopefully it matches up to it. So it's by far the most frustrating part of the business. But what we've done, I'll kind of tip to that, is now we're getting much lighter on spot buying hemp in the way that we've kind of done. There was great deals over that time, so we still had some successes. I don't want to knock that. But now we're actually trying to gravitate to direct to farmer relationships. And so we've made a lot of relationships in the Southeast, and we have multiple contracts for proven farmers to grow for us hemp wise. And so we understand that we negotiate a price, a poundage, they grow it, and then we execute payments from that contract at harvest time. So that's a much more predictable experience. You don't have to worry about where the price is. It's not going to flip on you. It's not going to change on you. And everyone can feel like they won.
How do they think they're going to get away with selling biomass that doesn't exist?
It's I don't know. I think it's because sometimes there's a lot of intermediaries in the process that can kind of cloud it up. I think it reminds me a little bit back in like 21, 22. Do you remember when like the ghost distributor conversation was happening in California, where you'd have people they'd go get a cannabis license for distribution. They would
Okay.
go to the grower. They would set like a 30-day payment term with the grower. They would take 1,000 pounds from the grower, and then they would go off the face of the earth.
Hmm.
It almost feels a little bit like that. I would say we've never had a deal go that bad to where it was like we paid money and there was nothing. Our issues have been way more about the potency was where we saw when we did our testing, or the material makeup is completely different. So when we got a sample, it was green, it was buddy, and the stuff that sent us was brown with a ton of stem and that. And so it's almost a little bit of a kind of a bait and switch situation more than that.
How long do you think until that kind of evens out of the industry?
My thought is soon. I am at least hopeful that this issue's gone away. I think a lot of those issues came up because the biomass that was largely being traded over the last couple of years was biomass from 19 to 21. That is very it's a well talked conversation that there's not a lot of that biomass still around. And so I think now a lot of the biomass that's going to be extracted is going to be freshly, newly grown. I think you will be able to go see that biomass being grown, which you couldn't do before. And I think the other part too is right, wrong, or indifferent. I think there was a lot of people trying to make up for problems that happened during the oversupply phase of hemp from 19, 20, around that time frame, where it's like, well, I lost my shirt, so I've at least got to get made whole. And if you can, it's also if you could return it, let's just say that if you could return the biomass, it would be so hard to do anyways, because we get 25,000s per truckload, so it comes on a full tractor trailer. And it's like you get this whole thing. It's like now you have to reload the whole truck back after you get testing. Then you have to do freight. Then it's got to make it there. Then you have to make sure you have so it's even like the return part of it's tough. So like we try to be understanding, and more times than not, we're like, hey, we get it. These things happen, but we need to find a way to make it right, because we still are out money. And then that causes issues where we have to treat the biomass in production. If it's not what we expected out or what we wanted, we then have to figure out how to handle it within our production system.
So as the industry's kind of working out through this oversupply from 19 and 20, do you foresee there being like a dip in supply, like a short-term dip?
That is the opinion of most. I think the opinion of most is that if you're going to extract biomass, it's going to be grown. I think it has led to price increases, so the hemp price is increasing. But I will say I think it's increasing at a rate that is higher than what it actually should be. Last year we were trading hemp 18 cents a point. So just on that math, if it's 10%, CBD, it'd be $1.80 a pound. I've had people call me trying to trade hemp at 50 cents a point. So creeping up on 3x in price. And I'll tell you what's not doing that is the extracts market. And so that's where I think you're seeing the tug of war now in the industry, is that you've got farming supply that's trying to increase price substantially, but you're effectively seeing no pricing increase to match those biomass increases from a 2 to 3x perspective. I mean, we have seen some increases, I would say, on the extract side, 10 to 15% in price increases, but it's nowhere near the pace at what cultivation is trying to charge. And there's also other interesting elements to cultivation. There's a lot of talk in the industry about biomass coming from outside of the country. South American biomass, South African biomass, a lot of conversations that we're hearing about that. But I mean, our perspective there is it's hard enough to buy hemp in the U.S. I couldn't imagine the level of sketchiness and everything you'd have to deal with from an international purchase. So there's always variables that are, supply and demand, and hopefully we'll get to see it balance out a little more, but it has been a challenge the last few years.
Do you foresee that happening? Like having to kind of adjust for an international market opening up?
Yeah, it is. It kind of is twofold. There's talks of biomass coming in from international, but there's a lot of CBD isolate that's being sent international as well. The European market are massive users. I think mostly when I hear about isolate going out of the country, it's for use there. The shift that I think people have to be aware of is that those countries, as we know, is they are getting more mature in regulation and opening things up. And it's hard to. We want to. I think when isolate gets going, I think we're totally interested in pursuing the international market, but it's not. I think it's tough to pin that on a long-term strategy because they eventually will stop paying the cost to import internationally and will begin to develop their own competencies. That's just how it goes. You can only outsource so long before you understand how much more cheaply you can do it. So I think it's something I think you'll see for a while of product or of isolate going out internationally, but you know how it is. They're going to want to do it themselves eventually, and as their countries get more open and people get more used to that, then I'm sure they will start doing their own. That's just my opinion.
Well, it's something that you've seen in other industries become so important is kind of traceability and supply chain integrity. It's kind of wild that, essentially to make sure that you're getting what you pay for, you need to have boots on the ground watching it through the entire process.
Mm-hmm. You do. Yeah. And you see a lot of those talks where they'll have international escrow agents that are kind of, watching it from shipment to delivery. And then when do you get paid versus when does it get shipped? And then there's also an element that, we always hear about is then you have customs intervention on both sides. And it's really, it'd be a full-time job for someone. If you really had a mature international shipping situation, you'd have someone full-time just having to deal with all the hurdles from that process. And it's interesting too, because we work with benchmarkers to look at what the hemp industry is doing, what hemp supply is. And there's a lot of hemp going out international, but a lot of the markers we've looked at, you're seeing some trends or some data that's showing that there may not be enough hemp even to satisfy what U.S. demand is. And that's also additionally scary because as we talked earlier with the Delta 9 drinks and things like that coming on board, every day there's new companies starting to do that. And so if you're already in a supply situation, to be able to do what you have now, there's more and more people making these products every day as time goes on.
Kyle, I really do appreciate you taking the time. And it's been really eye-opening. Just the scale that you guys are working on is incredible. Before we get out of here, is there anything else that you want to make sure the Cannabis Equipment News audience either knows about yourself or your work at Samson Extracts?
No, the main thing is we are going out there and letting people know that, we are a top hemp producer that's taking the biomass and extracting it. There's not a lot of people doing that. They like to take it crude or take it distillate or those things. And we do the dirty work. We do the extraction. We take it to the product. We will continue to see volumes increase. Our vision is that we're here for decades, not overnight success, millionaire type stuff. That's not. We're going to build reasonable margins at reasonable prices. And the big thing is our goal is that we will be isolating this summer. And so that really opens up a big part of our market. And we're just trying to let people know that there's a big time player down in South Alabama when it comes to the CBD and the hemp space.
Well, Kyle, it's a really exciting story, and I look forward to being able to follow it along.
Oh, yes, sir. David, hey, I appreciate you too, man. It's always fun talking cannabis, folks, and talking about our business and a little bit about myself, and I really appreciate the time.
Well, before we get out of here, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You can also help the podcast out a lot by leaving us a positive review on whatever platform you use. If you want to email the podcast, you can reach me at david@cannabisequipmentnews.com with email the podcast in the subject line. You can also subscribe to our newsletter. Make sure you get our daily newsletter delivered to your inbox first. All right. For Kyle Neathery, CEO of Samson Extracts, I'm David Manti. This is the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast. We'll see you next week.